The other day I went to a Starbucks and I was told by the teenage workers there that I couldn't come in without a face mask. Now I've read the Toronto mask bylaw and I know there's an exemption in it, and I told these kids that, but they're just kids. And they weren't gonna, I didn't want to argue with them, and they weren't really in a position to argue with me, so I just stood at the door and they gave me my Starbucks, but I wasn't pleased with it. Then I went to a neighborhood shop that I go into every week, and the lady there had a face mask on, but it wasn't even covering her nose. She told me to put a mask on too, and I said, hang on, you're not even wearing your mask properly. She said, I know, but I'm wearing it, put one on. And I thought, I don't want to go around life arguing with friends, people who I deal with on a regular basis, but neither do I want to have them impose some unscientific mask law on me. Now that the pandemic is over and we know, well, really, the mask doesn't do much, and it certainly doesn't do anything now. And I also know that there are specific exemptions in the law. And so I thought, what would happen if we helped educate shopkeepers everywhere, maybe with a little card, to teach them that there are exemptions in the law, and in fact, if they don't respect those exemptions, and worse, if they actually grill a customer like me about the exemptions, that is against the law. And so we came up with the idea of a card, a laminated card that people in Toronto or other cities could have. And if other cities across Canada do bring in mask bylaws, we could have cards for those cities too. And you could get that card at a new website, maskexemption.ca. And for every jurisdiction, Toronto or any other places that make a mandatory law rule, we would have right on the website an explanation of the requirements to provide proper exemptions. And joining me now in studio to talk about the exemptions in Toronto's law, and there'll be other similar exemptions in laws around the country, is our friend Aaron Rosenberg, a lawyer with ReLaw LLP. Aaron, great to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Now, the main thing that I as a citizen feel is I don't want to fight with people who are my friends and neighbors and teenagers working at a Starbucks. I don't want to be the lawyer guy, but just because they don't know there's an exemption, I don't want to have them force me to put on a muzzle, especially now that there's next to zero risk. The law, and let's talk about Toronto's bylaw 541-2020 it's called. It actually has a long list of exemptions, doesn't it?
It sure does. You know, some of the exemptions include if you have an underlying medical condition that makes it, you know, impossible for you to wear a mask. And the other, one of the other main ones that we'll be talking about is where there's a protected ground under the Human Rights Code that is reasonably accommodated by not wearing the mask.
So that could include, I don't know if it was your religion or if there was some other inherent characteristic. That's sort of a human rights catch-all. That's section 2A5 of the law. I'll just read it. Mm-hmm. The policy shall include the following exemptions from the requirement to wear a mask or face covering. Persons who are reasonably accommodated by not wearing a mask or face covering in accordance with the Ontario Human Rights Code. That's the one I want to focus on today. So if someone has a medical condition, obviously. People under 2 years old, you know, little kids, not covered, obviously. People who need help to remove it or put it back on, obviously. But let's talk about 2A5, because that's the basis upon which a number of people, I think, could legally carry a card and say, hey, shopkeeper, don't want to fight, but please check out maskexemption.ca and educate yourself, because not only do I have the right to be exempt from the mask, but if you ask me questions about it, that's against the law, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very clear, okay, that a person does not need to, a patron does not need to provide proof that they are exempted by one of these exemptions, which you just pointed out. But unfortunately, the way it appears, based on your experience and the experience of many others, is that there does need to be some sort of proof, something that people can show storekeepers who otherwise just aren't aware of the law and the exemptions to say, look, I need help. And it's no different than a handicap sticker, for example, which I think is the prime example. We don't require those that have some sort of disability to express the disability every single time they go somewhere in the city.
Yeah.
Instead, we have a very clear emblem that says, I need this parking spot. Here's the sticker. It's a visual stamp that shows that. So that's why I think these mass exemption cards are important, because normally the people that need the exemption or need the assistance the most are the ones that need this type of support the most.
Yeah, and again, I don't blame the shopkeepers I've encountered in the last few days for not knowing the law. How could they? They're not experts. This law was just cooked up. It's so weird that they're bringing in the mandatory mask now in July after the pandemic's over instead of in March and April when things were really iffy. And you know, the first case I mentioned of some teenage staffers at Starbucks, how on earth would they possibly know? And you don't want to get into a fight, but if you just had a card that said, hey, click here, guys, and just educate yourself a little bit on the law, because I don't want you breaking the law of exemptions. Let me read section 2D. So 2A outlined the exemptions, and we read one of them. But 2D says, the policy shall not require employees or members of the public to provide proof of any of the exemptions set out in section 2A. So, I mean, I suppose you could tell the shopkeeper what your exemption was if you wanted to talk about it, right. But this would be like if some shopkeeper said, prove you're handicapped, right. Prove you can't use your legs, you're in a wheelchair, prove it. Right. No, that would be crazy. Same thing here. If you have an exemption from this face mask, you could talk about it if you want, but no employee has the right to make you prove it. Is that what section 2D of the bylaw says? That's
exactly what it says. That's the letter of the law. But what we're seeing from the stories that are out there, from the reports, is that shopkeepers and patrons are having this tussle over what is an exemption, who is exempted, what's a bona fide exemption. That's all happening at the scene of these establishments. And again, that's why it's so important for people to be able to know what their rights are, to prove that in fact they do have an exemption, because the law says you don't need to prove it, but in practice it looks like you're going to have to.
Yeah. We're going off the Toronto City bylaw. Right. Elsewhere on our page, maskexemption.ca, we will look at the analogous wording in, for example, there's a bunch of towns and cities in the Peel regional municipality that have similar laws. I think that one city writes the law and a lot of others just sort of cookie cutter copy it. But we will have the tweaked wording for the different laws. I want to come to one exemption that I want to talk to you about. If you have a physical handicap, you can't put on a mask, you don't have the ability to take it on or off, that's specifically laid out in section 2A3. Mm-hmm. But section 2A5 says anything covered with the Ontario Human Rights Code. So that's everything from national origin, to gender, to physical ability, but they also have one word in there that I find interesting, creed, C-R-E-E-D, from the Latin credo, I believe. Creed means a belief system, doesn't it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, it's the courts have recognized creed to be a reflection of a comprehensive system of beliefs. And so you'll see that across Canada, people have used creed as a test ground to insert various types of belief systems. So for example, we've seen cases where vegans have brought forth tests with respect to creed, or those that disagree with animal cruelty. And so they'll use that creed as a way to show, look, this is my system of beliefs and it should be protected.
So it's more than just a hunch or a political talking point. It's a deep-seated system of beliefs. Yeah, and we might find them unusual or strange, right. But other people deeply believe in them. So, right. For example, I suppose atheism right. is quite obviously a creed.
Well, that's right. It's the absence of a religion.
But it's a worldview, it's a system of beliefs.
Exactly. And so that's, it's a bit of a catch-all to cover those that might not necessarily be viewed as a religion.
Got it. So obviously an atheist, I don't think there's anything in atheism that would be against wearing a face mask. But if someone like me had a deep-seated belief in personal liberty, who spent his whole life fighting for personal liberty, likes to think I believe in science and minimal infringements on personal liberty, my creed is live free or die. And my creed is I don't bend the knee to some junk science politicians in City Hall passing a law saying I have to wear a mask 3 months after the pandemic's over. That's my creed. Now, I'm not asking you to be a doctor telling me that's an exemption. I'm not asking you to be a judge judging my creed. I'm just saying that's my creed. And whether or not some court or some professor later on says libertarian, small government lifestyle, which I have practiced my entire life, is a creed, that's not the point, because the real point is the shopkeeper's not allowed to ask you to prove it.
Well, that's exactly right. So that would be, in my view, a reasonable position to take. Now, do you win the day at the end of a human rights tribunal case? That would be left to be seen. But ultimately, again, as you pointed out, the shopkeeper is not in a position to be challenging that exemption.
So maybe one day a judge or a human rights tribunal member would say, nah, Levant, believing in personal freedom, living a small government belief system, that's not a creed. And I could see that happening in Canada, frankly. I happen to believe it is a creed. But what you're saying is it's not for the shopkeeper to decide, because Section 2D says the policy shall not require employees or members of the public to provide proof of any of the exemptions set out in Section 2A.
And that's the problem with this whole bylaw system, is that the burden has been placed onto shopkeepers, shopkeepers that have been hit hard by the pandemic, that want to rebuild their business, and frankly probably do not want to be dealing with this issue. But because the city, for whatever reason, has decided that they don't want to be the ones enforcing this issue, they've left it to the shopkeepers to be the bad guys.
Yeah, I think it's a cowardly approach to lawmaking. Instead of having city police, which by the way have other things to do, instead of having bylaw officers do it, they have other real things to do. They're actually trying to turn every shopkeeper into a cop, into a bylaw officer. It's incredibly unfair on the shopkeepers. It's unfair to customers who, when they deal with a cop, at least know the cop understands the law. When I'm dealing with those teenage staffers at Starbucks, I'm not going to push back on them like I would a cop, because how on earth would they know the law? They're just teenage Starbucks workers. I think this is a cowardly law written by cowardly politicians, but there is that safety valve of Section 2D. The policy shall not require employees or members of the public to provide proof of any of the exemptions set out in Section 2A. So it is my creed, my worldview, my deeply held belief system that I've practiced my whole life, that I am not going to wear a muzzle because John Tory, the cowardly mayor of Toronto, or any other mayor says so, without scientific or epidemiological basis.
So the way that you articulated that, try to imagine now, if we go for a walk, go into a Starbucks, you're going to have the same kid there, and you're going to express this well-articulated creed. It's impossible.
No chance. And they would laugh at me, and by the way, I wouldn't want to put them through that. Because they're just a kid working at Starbucks, or they're just a gal at the bakery that I go to get sandwiches. And I don't want to turn everything into a fight. And that's where maskexemption.ca comes in. Because we are going to have little cards that have these key sections of the law explaining the rights. So you don't have to talk, you don't have to argue, you just show the card. And they'll have the website, maskexemption.ca, that will link to this video and other short videos explaining a video for employers, a video for members of the public, and what the law is. And hopefully, the combination of the card that has the summary and the info right on it, And the website, for those who are truly interested, will diffuse most of these situations. I've seen this before. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, had little cards sometimes that they would give out to people for what to say if they were arrested.
Right.
Now, in that case, you're dealing with professional police officers who would say, oh, they have the right to remain silent. I know that's true. I'm not going to argue. I don't think this is going to be 100% successful, because you're going to have some shopkeepers who are confused and scared and angry and stressed out.
Right.
But I hope that maskexemption.ca, combined with people using that card calmly and say, listen, I understand you're confused by the new law. Please take a second to look at my rights and your responsibilities. And if you need more, click on maskexemption.ca, because I have an exemption and you're not actually allowed to even ask me about it. So please take a look.
Yeah, well, I think that's really, I hope that will be effective. I think this is an important initiative for those that disagree in principle with the mask bylaws, but also those that really have a bona fide protected ground other than that, that need the assistance and may not be able to articulate it.
Yeah, that's right. No one under 2 has to wear a mask. Anyone who has an underlying medical condition including it's difficult to breathe. That's such an important one. It's difficult to breathe with a mask. Anyone who needs help to remove or put on the mask. There are a lot of exemptions. The one that I would likely rely on is creed. All right, I want to close on this. And we'll put this up as a separate video on the website. Advice to shopkeepers. So a shopkeeper comes on maskexemption.ca. They're a little confused, they're a little put off because they have a problem that they didn't want. What is the #1 thing that shopkeepers need to know about someone with a maskexemption.ca card?
Well, you know, I would say that it's really a no questions policy. If the exemption is cited, you don't need proof of the exemption, and so you just let the person go about their business, because according to this bylaw, there's nothing you can do.
And in fact, if you try to make someone prove the exemption, you could be violating their rights under the Ontario Human Rights Code.
Well, that's right, and you know what? That's a really interesting point, is that it appears that the contravention provision is meant to address those that are not complying. That would be establishments that do not put in place a policy, or those that are not complying with it. But there's another side to this, which you pointed out, which is that if establishments are not complying with the exemptions, then they could be at risk of contravening it itself.
So a good practice for a shop would be ask people to put on a mask, but as soon as they say, no, I'm exempt, you can't ask questions about it, and you should accommodate the exemption, because it's not up to you to judge the exemption. It may be up to someone else, maybe the Human Rights Commission, it may be the police, but it ain't up to the shopkeeper.
Yeah, it's really, there's no right to get into a cross-examination with a patron who is citing an exemption.
It would be like demanding someone in a wheelchair prove they can't use their legs.
It's unseemly, and it's certainly not in the spirit of the bylaw as it was drafted.
All right, so that's your advice for shopkeepers. What's your advice for a customer, a citizen, someone like me who just wants a coffee, just wants a sandwich? I think probably the key is stay calm, realize you're not dealing with trained police officers or lawyers, and to me, I would think calmly invite them to read what the law is on the card, and if that doesn't put the problem away, have them go to maskexemption.ca. That's my hunch. What would you say as a lawyer to a customer who wants to use this mask exemption card?
Well, look, I agree. I mean, I think that the directing the shop owner or the shopkeeper to the mask exemption website and the card and trying to explain it, I think the focus is de-escalation, because I think what we've seen in the reports of those that are citing exemptions is that things escalate quickly, and not necessarily between the most important parties, being the patron and the shopkeeper, but rather those other folks around that decide that they want to interject as a political matter to reflect on their political issues.
Yeah, we saw that recently in Ontario, a tragic case of actually turn into a shooting,
Right.
if you can believe it.
Right.
And tempers are high, stress is high, people are unemployed. There's a lot of genuine worry about the pandemic and a lot of fake worry and public health theater, I call it. So this is a challenging situation. Well, Aaron, I got one last question for you. If there is a customer out there who uses the mask exemption and has his rights violated under Section 2D, if a shopkeeper tries to grill him for proof of the exemption, and again, I say Section 2D specifically says you cannot demand proof, would you consider, with our assistance to crowdfund it, would you consider legally representing that customer against whoever was violating 2D, whether that's going to the Human Rights Commission or just writing a demand letter to, I mean, I don't know what the remedy would be, but would you be interested in helping people whose rights were violated by not having their mask exemption respected?
The short answer is yes, and the long answer is very quite simple, and this is my belief with respect to all laws, is that laws are in place to be enforced. Otherwise, what's the point? Now, whether that's a bylaw or whether that's federal legislation, you have to be able to access the mechanisms in the law to enforce your rights. And so this bylaw provides a very clear path to enforce and to examine the law, the issue that you're being attacked on, being allowed to use your exemption. So yes, it's important for people to enforce those laws, and I would be privileged and honored in order to be able to do so.
All right, well, we might take you up on that if we have problems. So folks, there you have it. A detailed review of Toronto's mask bylaws. I deal with Toronto because we're based here in Toronto, Aaron's in Toronto. Toronto's Canada's largest city, and I fear it will be a template for other mask requirement cities too. So we've shown you the sections in Toronto's bylaw. In the course of time, we will have other mask bylaws in Canada up there too. You can order your mask exemption card, which will be a laminated card that you can keep in your wallet. You want to keep it on you because when you go into establishments, you want to pull it out if you have that problem. And I'm afraid you are going to have that problem because most people don't know about the exemption. My advice is stay calm, keep the energy low, and just calmly and say, I know you haven't heard of this, but here's the law, please read it. If you're still skeptical, please go to maskexemption.ca. Hopefully they will, and if your rights are violated, you can fill out the form on maskexemption.ca and tell us what happens. And if it's a case that we think would help set a precedent, you heard him, Aaron would take the case and we would crowdfund that so you yourself would not be on the hook for the costs. So go to maskexemption.ca to read the law, learn about your rights, and most importantly, learn how shopkeepers, who are really victims of this too, don't have the power to demand proof of you. You can, I suppose, make a little mask exemption card yourself, but if you order one from us, we'll mail it to you. It'll come a little laminated card, and it'll have the specific sections and the website that you can show people. It's something to keep in your wallet as you go around the city until this madness ends. So make sure to go to maskexemption.ca. Aaron, thanks very much. We fight for civil liberties. We don't just talk about them. Yeah. We fight for them.
Thank you so much.
All right. Go to maskexemption.ca. We've had a civil liberties lawyer examine the mask bylaws, and there are plenty of exemptions. You just don't have to wear it if you're covered by those exemptions, and shopkeepers aren't allowed to ask you to prove you're exempt. For more details, go to maskexemption.ca, and if you're exempt, you can download a free card to carry in your wallet to show shopkeepers. That's at maskexemption.ca.